Good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Walker. I'm a class of 2000 alum and graduate, and employee of the college as the executive director of the new Meadville Community Revitalization Corporation. My office is actually downtown in Diamond Park in the Founders House, but it's my pleasure to welcome you here to Allegheny College. Both our alumni community, who is here for reunion weekend, and our Meadville community. And I'll explain that today's presentation is part of a larger 1825 commemoration celebration here in Meadville. This morning's presentation was born and conceived by our presenter, Richard Arthur, probably 18 months ago or more, when Dick reached out to the college, researching and preparing for Lafayette's visit, his farewell tour, a 13-month visit to the United States that included visits to all 24 states. And it was his June 2nd, 1825 visit to Meadville and Allegheny College that brings us here to today's presentation. What Dick didn't know then was that a group of Meadville citizens were also planning their own commemoration of 1825, a fairly prolific year in Meadville's history, just 37 years after its founding by David Mead in 1788. 1825 saw the founding of the congregations of Christ Episcopal Church, Stone Methodist Church, and our Unitarian Church. This group, aptly named Meadville 1825, has organized over 24 free public programs this year to commemorate the many historic events that happened in and around 1825. This morning's presentation is one of them. Thank you, Armstrong Cable, who is also recording and will replay the event. So thank you to the Meadville 1825 committee. A few notes. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Josh Schertz with the Crawford County Historical Society, who is our partner in crime here this morning and helping us to prepare. Want to also share, and Dick will mention this as well, and he'll talk about some of the items here, but the Lafayette Rock there's a memorial, memorial is not the right word, it's a marker, historic marker, is placed on the east side of Rice Hall, between Rice Hall and North Main Street. If you were a student, we've probably walked by it hundreds of times not knowing it was there. Might have been obscured by rhododendrons or otherwise, but the construction fence will have been moved during our talk, and so afterwards, if you want to meander up the hill for a portion this morning, it'll be accessible as part of the construction of Rice Hall. Lastly, Bentley Hall, just behind me, of course, is will be open for self-guided tours. But I'm told that Jed Miller, Jonathan Helmreich, and Cliff Willis, who are very much intimately engaged in the planning and of the rehabilitation of Bentley Hall, will be around to answer questions. And Jed has shared with me that recently published Building Bentley, the Temple Alden, is available in the bookstore for $15, Jed, is that what you told me? So if you're interested, visit the bookstore about Bentley Hall. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Dick Arthur. And Dick, I'm going to read mostly, each of you might have picked up a program. I'm going to read a bio that Dick shared with me. Richard Arthur is a 1972 graduate of Allegheny, and shortly after graduation, he was drafted into the Army, where he remained for the next 23 years. Although never expecting for that to be his career, he remained once he saw the opportunity to participate in the rebuilding of the Army in the wake of the Vietnam War. He led troops, developed training manuals, and helped prepare doctrine. He has dedicated much of his post-retirement life to the study of America in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He has lectured at locations across western Pennsylvania, most notably the Washington Trail Summit and the Jefferson Educational Society in Erie. He participated in the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's return to America last August in New York City. And he is careful to mention that he is not a professional historian, but rather he reads a lot of their work and digests it for accurate and hopefully interesting storytelling. He and his wife, Mary Lou, class of 1973, live in rural Erie County, where they provide respite for their hardworking 4 sons and their children. Dick, thank you for joining us this morning.
I can't tell you how excited and privileged I am to be here today. This is a very special thing for me, and I thank you for this opportunity. I have spent the last year and a half in service to an important figure in our history whose tale I will be telling here soon. But first, I want to make mention of a couple things. This location is very special to me. A few years back, right here, my wife, Mary Lou, and I exchanged our promises, went out that back door, and into our 50-plus year adventure. I thank you so much, Mary Lou, for your support during all of this time. There were a lot of missed meals and a lot of miles, and you were right there with me, and I thank you. I also want to recognize today the fact that my time at college was not easy. I was not an excellent student. I labored very hard to catch up to where so many of my peers were. I had problems at home with my family, and the specter of war was always over my head. I was fortunate in my experience here at Allegheny to have an advisor who guided me and gave me opportunity and gave me the gumption to stick through what I needed to do to complete my degree. So my thanks to Paul Zolbrod. I attended his memorial service yesterday. It was very moving. He will be sadly missed. Marie, Paul, Yves, Gilbert, Demotier, who I will call from now on Lafayette, was born in the center of France, far from the salons of Paris or the court of Versailles. His father had been killed in battle before he ever saw his son, and his mother hated living out in the country. So she took off, went to Paris to be part of the court, and left young Lafayette in the hands of his grandparents and great-grandparents. He lived in the country, and he loved it. He was able to gather his friends from town and lead them into battle to become a soldier fighting monsters, or maybe the British that lived just outside of his home. He wanted to be a soldier. He wanted to be in service to his king. That was his greatest goal. But unfortunately, at age 9, when his grandparents all passed away, he inherited a title, Marquis, and a large fortune at age 9. And his mother decided he needed to go to Paris to become a polished member of upper society in France. He hated this. He had to do things like learn courtly manners, such as making witty conversation, or maybe learning to play cards, learning to dance. Oh, that was painful for Lafayette. He didn't like dancing. And Marie Antoinette used to laugh when he tried to dance. And he had to learn to ride a horse properly, not just get on and ride, but have the bearing of a proper gentleman. This was training that he didn't want. He wanted to be a real soldier. Now, while he was at Versailles, he had the opportunity to touch base with a lot of people from the Enlightenment. He knew Voltaire. He knew Rousseau. He was able to experience a lot of these things. But as a young rich man, more than anything else, he was probably a target for a lot of lords who wanted to marry off their daughters. An arranged marriage was made with the Count Noailles for his daughter Adrienne. They were married at 14 and 15 years old. And for the first 2 years, they lived apart because their parents thought, well, they're not ready for that level of intimacy. But they would eventually become lifelong partners and live amazing lives. He was, through his Count of Noailles contacts, able to get into a ceremonial unit. It was kind of like parade ground type soldiering. Not really to his liking, but it was better than nothing. He was sent over to Metz in eastern France, where he encountered a couple things. He met a bunch of other officers from other parts of the country. They introduced him to some new ideas. He became a Mason. That was very important to him. But most important of all, he met a man who would change his life. This was a British officer, surprisingly, because remember, he didn't like the British, but this guy was a little different. He was the Duke of Gloucester, and he had the opportunity to tell young Lafayette at age 19 about the American Revolution, which he thought was a great idea. And he thought there was a concept out there called liberty. And he talked to Lafayette about liberty, and it was something that he had never really heard of, but eventually he stuck to it like honey to toast. And that became a calling, we would say, for Lafayette. This guy also told him that the leader of the revolution, George Washington, was a really, really good guy. And Lafayette and his friends said, we've got to go and we've got to meet Washington and we've got to be part of that movement. An interesting fact here, the Duke of Gloucester is the brother of King George III. So Lafayette goes to Paris and meets with American emissaries who were there trying to recruit some talent for the revolution. He meets Benjamin Franklin. Franklin is impressed, mostly because he has a lot of contacts and a lot of money. So he writes a letter to Benjamin Franklin and sends that over. Lafayette is determined to leave France, go to America, but the king has said, no more Frenchmen fleeing for American wars and glory and everything else. You've got to stay in France. So in order to get out, he would have to sneak out. And that's what he did. He actually employed a lot of ruses. He went to Spain and he bought a ship, because you can do that if you're the richest man in Europe. And he outfitted some fellow soldiers, and he prepared to get out of town. And this involved sneaking through back alleys in disguise, possibly in disguise as a woman at times, loading up your ship at a small port and preparing to leave. Now, the king knew that Lafayette was planning to leave, so he sent out a posse to try to catch him and keep him from leaving. They arrived down in Bordeaux just in time to see the sails of Lafayette's ship sinking over the horizon. He had a very, very difficult crossing. He was seasick most of the time. They were living in mortal fear of either the French or the British, who might capture him and use him as ransom, or pirates. He was trying to learn English while he was on the ship because he really didn't speak any English at all. And he was trying to learn military tactics from some textbooks that he brought. Eventually, he was fortunate enough to get into port, small port called Georgetown, South Carolina. He couldn't sail into Charleston. They would have caught him. And the first person he meets on this quest for liberty is an enslaved individual who, by the way, spoke French. And he told Lafayette, Philadelphia is that way. So he has to go and meet with the Congress. He buys an expensive carriage. It breaks down quickly. He buys smaller carriages. They break down. He travels in a wagon. He travels on horseback. he arrives in Philadelphia basically on foot. His first job, oh, I forgot to tell you, he left France without telling his pregnant wife. Why? Probably plausible deniability. This is a letter that he would eventually send back, and I absolutely love this letter. Dear heart, it is from very far away I'm writing you. Have you forgiven me by now? Soldier of freedom, the freedom I idolize, I come as a friend to offer my help to this very interesting republic, bringing with me only my sincerity and goodwill. I have no desire for personal gain. I don't think that's necessarily true. But by my laboring for my glory, I labor for their happiness. Now, he's going to talk about a place he's never been. The happiness of America is intimately tied to the happiness of all humanity. America will become the respected and peaceful and secure haven of virtue, tolerance, equality, and peaceful freedom. He never, for the rest of his life, varied from that particular sentiment. Never. He arrives in Philadelphia and has to go to the Congress. How is he received in the Congress? Well, let me give you an example you probably can understand. Remember in the movie The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy and her entourage arrive at the Emerald City and knock on the door, and the man with the fuzzy hat comes out and says, "Go away, go away." They had so many European officers showing up, they were just sick of them. Washington later said, if I had no European officers except for the Marquis, I would be happy. But John Hancock, the president of the Senate, had a little different perspective. He had that letter from Franklin. And Lafayette had a bag of money. He gave him 70,000 pounds of money for the cause. And he said, I will serve without pay. So, to continue my analogy with the Wizard of Oz, that's a horse of a different color. That got him the ticket that he needed for a very special and very important meeting. Late summer 1777, Lafayette meets George Washington. I would argue this was the beginning of the most important personal relationship possibly in the history of our country. Lafayette sees Washington. He is immediately impressed. No story there because everybody was immediately impressed when they met George Washington. What is different is what did Washington think when he saw 20-year-old Lafayette? I'm going to tell you a secret about our founding father, the guy in the dollar bill. He was a clothes horse. He was immediately impressed with Lafayette's uniform, which was better than any uniform in the room. And he was also very impressed with his rigid demeanor, appearance that was groomed when he was over in the court of Versailles. So something did come of that that was important. Washington says, I am going to look out for you. And a couple days later, they have what Lafayette would call the Great Conversation. This is where they exchanged information about each other that basically formed their relationship. And there are really two important aspects to this. First of all, both of these men were basically spurned by their country. Lafayette wanted to serve in the real army, and he was sent off to some little parade unit. Washington wanted to serve the British king and had done so during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and repeatedly had made great sacrifices. And his response to a request to become a British officer You're a colonial, you'll never be one of us. So both of these men had been spurned. Something else. Lafayette never knew his father. Washington never had any natural children. So you can see where some of this was coming together. Lafayette took the opportunity to plead, "I wish to lead troops." But Washington, being a very wise man, remembering his own experiences at age 20, 21, that didn't go so well, he's thinking, "I like you, Lafayette. I know you have come to learn and not to teach. I respect you, but you're not ready yet. I will bring you into my staff." Now, this is where my fellow English majors will appreciate the value of proper language and understanding context. Washington, in extending this offer, used the British term for staff. He told Lafayette, "You will be part of my family. You have an orphan, a fatherless, or a man who has no children. You'll be part of my family, and you have the language barrier." So Lafayette may have had the wrong idea at this time. But nevertheless, he was with Washington, and that was really, really important to him. But his opportunity to lead troops, he'd have to wait for that. And he had to wait 5 full weeks. The British were coming up the Chesapeake Bay. They were threatening the capital of Philadelphia. Washington throws up a pretty good defense along a small creek called the Brandywine, south of Philadelphia. He's doing a pretty good job, holding off the British regulars. But a Quaker family that was loyalist went to the British and said, "Hey, there's a ford down here you can use, and you can cross your troops. They can come in, they can flank Washington and hit his army from the side." They did that, and things started to fall apart. Douglas Freehall is a great biographer of Washington and admired him. But he actually used the word that he was panicked when these events started to unfold. So you can only imagine what's going on at Washington's headquarters. What are we going to do? Is our army going to be wiped out? Seizing the moment and using what I would call a put-me-in-their-coach type approach, Lafayette says, "Send me in." Washington, distracted, probably said, "Well, go." Okay? He goes out, no military experience, never been under fire. He goes out in broken English, rallies the troops, gets them organized, protects the flank. There was no victory for Washington on that day, but they did manage to save the army. In the middle of all this, at Brandywine, Lafayette is wounded. He takes a bullet to the leg and continues to lead. Nathaniel Greene goes back to Washington and says, "This guy fights. He's courageous. He's great." Washington turns to his personal surgeon and says, "Take care of this man as if he were my son." Lafayette recovers, and he does essentially the same thing in New Jersey. Several months later, he helps pull a defeat out of the bag and turns into at least a tie, a long, hot battle being fought. Again, the army is saved. Lafayette plays a role. At the end of this very long day, George Washington lays down his cloak. He's almost completely exhausted. He lays down to go to sleep, as he would normally any time they're in the field. But he tells Lafayette, "You come over here and you can lay down beside me." Nathaniel Greene said that never happened. Washington never extended that type of courtesy to anybody. So there was a special, special relationship there. He shared the hardships of Valley Forge with Washington. And then he went to France. He went back to France. What did he do? He went back to secure the tools and the forces and the troops that we needed, the Navy we needed, to win the Revolutionary War. Of course, he had help from American diplomats, but I don't know how much success they would have had Lafayette not been there with his personal contacts and so on. When Lafayette was in France, Washington was perpetually asking people who would come into his headquarters who had recently arrived from Paris, "Did you see Lafayette over there?" And one man said, "Yes, I did, and he was a very fine man." Washington was so moved, he took his hands and quivered a bit, like a father caring for his son. The war goes on. The French, however, arrive en masse. Lafayette brings over about 40% of the entire French army. And most significantly, he brings over a fleet. Now, normally what happens in an engagement between the French Navy and the British Navy is the British Navy cleans their clock. But not at the Battle of Capes off of Hampton Roads outside of Norfolk. They prevail on a 3-day battle at sea, and then they can bottle up the British, trap them in Yorktown, and eventually cause a surrender. At the surrender, the British want to surrender to Lafayette. Why? Because he's a real officer from a real country, not these people over here. Lafayette refuses the sword and insists that they surrender to the Americans. Washington and Lafayette have a relationship that extends beyond the war. And after the war, shortly, Lafayette comes to Washington's home at Mount Vernon, spends several weeks there. And we learned so much about Washington from this visit. We learned that he loves to have kids around the house, for example. And Lafayette's so impressed because that doesn't happen in France. I'll bet you never thought of Grandpa George being something. You always think of him as that dour guy on the dollar bill. But he was really very tender with children. You also learned that Washington liked ham and chicken, and he wrote back to his wife saying that he was preoccupied with the affairs of Mount Vernon, which I think all of us know. He was in love with his property and his enterprise there. There was a disagreement between Washington and Lafayette. It's important to understand this. Lafayette's idea of liberty was unalloyed. It was total. Liberty meant liberty for everyone. So he proposed to Washington a scheme that would allow them to have a plantation where they'd be taking in slaves, training them, and then pushing them out into the economy as free people, emancipated people. He said, if we do this, it'll catch on and other people will do it because they'll be watching you. Well, Washington is basically unable to extract himself from the slave culture. It's not because he necessarily opposed Lafayette. He had, after all, black soldiers who served with him. He had black spies in his army. But it was just a bridge too far for Washington, but not for Lafayette. Lafayette returns to France in the middle of turmoil. I will not go into the exhaustive history of the French Revolution except to just encapsulate it by saying you had a bunch of crazies over here, you had a bunch of crazies over here. They took turns cutting each other's heads off. In the middle, there were people who were trying to be moderate, and that was what Lafayette was trying to do. He was trying to convince the French to adopt a British-style government with a king He wasn't trying to displace the king, but with a constitution that allowed participation from people. During this time, he and Thomas Jefferson co-authored the Declaration of Human Rights. This became adopted by the French about 60 years later, not in time for the Revolution, but it eventually became part of the UN Charter as well, and is part of the French Constitution to this day. So eventually his ideas did prevail, but not very soon. If you're the man in the middle, if you're the voice of moderation in political turmoil, you are in danger. And there became a point at which Lafayette decided that he had to pick up and leave France to save his own life. So he went to Prussia, where he thought he would be safe. But the Prussians thought, erroneously, that he was anti-king. So they clamped him in irons and threw him in prison. Testament to the love of his family, his wife and 2 daughters went to prison and stayed in the cell with him because it was more important for their family to be together than it was for them to be free. His son had safety in exile over here in America, staying at Mount Vernon, where Washington, trying to avoid political turmoil, kind of had him hidden away off the public eye, so he didn't anger any of the forces in France against the country. Let's skip ahead to 1824. The President of the United States, James Monroe, you might remember him as that lieutenant that helped drag Lafayette off the battlefield at Brandywine, decides that as America approached its 50th anniversary, we needed to bring Lafayette, who was the only surviving general of the Revolution, back as our nation's guest. So he went to Congress, they got an appropriation, they sent a ship over. He is now almost impoverished and without a title, having lost all of that in the Revolution. But he is excited about returning to America. But not as excited as the Americans were to receive him, because when he came into New York, there were thousands and thousands of people, well exceeding the population of New York City at the time, there to greet him. People screaming, "I touched him, I saw him." He was, in living memory, only a generation or 2 away, so people knew who he was and valued his contribution to our freedom. Everywhere he went for the next 14 months, every town, large and small, he was greeted with bowers of flowers. He was greeted with bad speeches, mediocre bands, hundreds of well-wishers who would come up and shake his hand, and he would shake the hand of anyone. You could be important or the hoi polloi, didn't make any difference. Everyone was important and welcomed, always smiling, cheerful, energetic, despite the exhausting toll of traveling to all 24 of our states at the time. One example is that when he went to Philadelphia, for example, the city fathers decided we were going to do something to welcome Lafayette, and why don't we have it in front of the old State House, and why don't we go down there and have a big celebration? Well, when they went down there, they found out this place was falling apart. So they put in a lot of effort to preserve and restore the building that they started calling Independence Hall. That was the type of reaction again and again and again. Really quite remarkable. He would go to Baltimore, he would be greeted by a 19-year-old poet who would read some kind of laudatory comment to him. Edgar Allan Poe, he had his painting done by Samuel F.B. Morse. He met James Fenimore Cooper. Everywhere he went, he would be greeted. He met every one of the first 7 presidents of the United States. Every one of them. And of course, except George Washington, they were all at one time on this tour. Eventually, he comes to our area. He comes up the Ohio River, and just before he gets to Wheeling, Virginia, because that's what Wheeling was Virginia at the time, his barge sinks, and his son, George Washington Lafayette, saves everyone on the boat. Unfortunately, Lafayette lost the cane that George Washington had given him. It was almost never out of his grip. But he takes the national road from there and he enters into western Pennsylvania. Now, he is enamored with anything that has to do with George Washington or it's named Washington. So the first town he goes to is Washington, PA. And the next day he goes to Fayette County, where he visits Albert Gallatin, who was a friend of his from their days in Paris. Albert Gallatin was a Swiss immigrant, kind of like himself, and they had been working together in Paris. He was also Secretary of the Treasury at one time. He had several days in Pittsburgh, and they had very laudatory celebrations, ad nauseum, paintings along the way, celebrations and dances. But he starts from Pittsburgh and comes up to our region. And the first stop he makes is in Butler. The photograph on the left is actually a photograph taken about 15 years later, but it is actually the building where he stayed. And we know he ate a whole bunch of sauerkraut when he was there. And they had bad bands and long speeches. And he shook over 400 hands. We know that. The building on the right is called the Lafayette Building, and that is in place today in recognition. He spent the night up in Mercer, and he stayed at this hotel, which years later burned down. But when it burned down, the owner rushed back into the hotel, went to Lafayette's bed, which they had kept, and it wouldn't fit out the window so he could save it. So he chopped it up and threw it out the window in pieces. And if you go to the Mercer County Historical Society, you can see that bed today. Then he came up to Meadville. He had lunch up here at the Sign of the Stag, which is approximately in the location of the Meadville Mall down at Water and Chestnut Street, for those of you familiar with town. And he was served tea, and the Crawford County Historical Society has brought that tea set that they use. So I encourage all of you sometime to come up and take a look at this. And after lunch, he came up here to the college. He signed the guest book. That guest book is over here, and I encourage everyone to go over and look. There you see the signatures of Lafayette, George Washington Lafayette, and Levasseur, who was his secretary, who accompanied him on his journey. We don't know what he said that day, but I know what he said time and time and time again, because a lot of the speeches are very repetitious, as you might expect. And they pretty much are the same thing over and over in tone and in content. So with your indulgence, I have reconstructed what I think he might have said based on what he said a lot of other places. I am using his words out of context and putting them together to solve this puzzle for us today. I hope I can express, without using any French accent, the enthusiasm, joy, and unadulterated patriotism that would have been out of his mouth. It is a great happiness to receive this welcome of my countrymen, and a real pleasure, sir, that I find myself at this college on the frontier of an expanding nation. The improvements here are striking evidence of the tendency of liberal political institutions to promote learning. I feel myself overwhelmed with inexpressible emotion at the sight of America after so long of an absence. It is the pride of my heart to be among the earliest adopted sons of America and to visit places of importance to George Washington. I will no longer trespass on your time other than to thank you in the name of my revolutionary contemporaries and myself, and to offer my fervent prayers for the success of this college and for the preservation of this free government and the union between these states upon which rests the hope of mankind. I love America. Adieu. A member of the class of 1899 dedicated this rock that is approximately 100 feet from Rice Hall. When we talk about forgotten history, this is a great example. When I was a freshman, we used to have to wear little dinks, and the upperclassmen would come around and they'd quiz you. They'd ask you about William McKinley and a cow. Or they'd ask you about the bridge over the ravine. Or they would ask you for the words to the alma mater. Those were things you needed to know. But they never said anything about Lafayette. Nothing. And this magnificent monument that was put up by a member of the class of '99 was shrouded with azaleas and other type of vegetation, and I walked by it every day for 4 years and never read it, never looked at it. But recently the college has recognized that that's important, and they've fixed it up. Now today I understand you might be able to go and see that rock. It's 9 feet high up beside Rice Hall. I encourage you to go up there and take a look at it if you can. It recognizes both Washington coming through this area and the visit of Lafayette. From here, he went up to Waterford, where he spent the night, and he did not spend the night in the Eagle Hotel. I'm the curator of the Eagle Hotel. And all the time people say, did George Washington stay here? Did Lafayette stay here? No, Washington slept on the ground outside of where the Eagle Hotel is, and Lafayette went over to look at it while it was under construction. So that is our mark of fame. From there, he got a cavalry escort that took him up to Erie, and at Federal Hill, all the way from Federal Hill, all the way down to the lake, there were lines of people coming from who knows where to see Lafayette and treat him as a national hero. The library, or excuse me, the Hagen History Center has a lot of different paraphernalia from that event. You can go up and see some of that. My favorite is the tablecloth that they have from the event, which was saved by Mr. Colt, who organized the event, which was taking place on a 200-foot-long table that they constructed over Mill Creek. The tablecloth has a coffee spill on it. No one ever bothered to launder the coffee spill because it was Lafayette who spilled the coffee, and they wanted to remember where he sat. They exchanged a whole bunch of toasts. This is Lafayette's toast to Erie. Again, short, to the point. When he left here, he had an appointment he wanted to make. He wanted to be at Bunker Hill on the 4th of July. So he went up to Buffalo, went partly on the Erie Canal over towards Massachusetts, and he was able to get there just in time so that he and Daniel Webster could do what we always see in the newspaper, you know, taking the shovel. Yeah. Well, he got there, and he brought with him a cask, small barrel, and he filled that up with some dirt, and he took it back to France with him. Such was his love of country. He wanted a piece of America with him. So, the visit, 1824-25, 3,000 miles, 14 months, 24 states, visit with every one of our first 7 presidents. Really quite remarkable. I read a whole bunch of books. My friend Don Pierce from the Historical Society found this little ditty, who knows where, and he gave it to me as if it was just something he found. This book was printed in 1825, so it is a contemporary account of the trip of Lafayette. I read parts of it, and I was particularly charmed with the conclusion written in beautiful 19th century prose. The hero of these memoirs has displayed a triumph unparalleled in the annals of the world. Not only the triumph of the hero, the patriot, the philanthropist alone, but the triumph of principles, integrity, and virtue through all the extremes of prosperity and adversity, from the summit of popular power to 5 long years of imprisonment under the severities of the iron hand of despotism. Always true to himself, he remains unsullied with any touch of dishonor. And I think that is absolutely true of Lafayette. When American troops went to France in World War I, General Pershing took his staff over to the grave of Lafayette. You see them saluting here. You no doubt remember that Colonel Stanton on his staff said, "Lafayette, we are here as if we're repaying a debt." What you can't maybe appreciate is, you see the flowers there in the grave? Part of the soil is from that cask of Bunker Hill. Okay. Given the academic environment, I'm sure all of you would appreciate that we have an assignment. We are approaching our 250th anniversary next year, and I'm sure that all of you will have numerous occasions at cocktail parties or at dinner table discussions to have a historical discussion. I'm counting on you for this, okay? I'm going to suggest you throw out this topic. What makes a founding father? And here are some things you could throw out. You could say, gee, you could be a diplomat like Benjamin Franklin and bring the French to our rescue. You could be a financier like Robert Morris and just lose your entire fortune in the cause. You could be a military hero like Nathaniel Greene. You could be a political philosopher like Jefferson or John Adams. Each of these men distinguished themselves in one of these categories, or some of them actually in 2. But can you imagine anyone who might have been a philosopher, a philanthropist, a soldier, a diplomat? Of course you can. You met them this morning. I thank you for your time. Adieu. Thank you. Later, Gator.